This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And sponsored by Uber Creative Agency, a boutique web design, development, and marketing agency based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with clients across the U.S. We don't just provide services, we deliver value.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
And welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. This is an interesting one today, Frida, because we're going to be speaking with Blake Freking. Now, Blake Freking, if you follow mushing, that name sounds familiar, and I know that we've introduced him at the starts of the UP 200, the sled dog races in Marquette, but you really were instrumental in getting this set up because it's not just that, it's a storytelling opportunity, isn't it?
Well, certainly. When you look at our 5 parks, and of course, because Isle Royal is basically shut down in the winter from winter study, but the other 4 all have sled dog races. So, of course, we are most familiar with the UP 200, which runs into Pictured Rocks. And then there's the Apostle Islands, and they have an Apostle Island race. They also have a Northern Pines race. The Keweenaw, the Copper Dog, the first weekend in March, it's such a riot, but the granddaddy, really the granddaddy of all these races, the oldest, longest race, I believe in the lower 48, and we're going to have to check that fact with Blake, but that is the Beargrease, and it's coming up very shortly here at the end of January, and it's been, I believe, over 40 years that they've had a Beargrease.
Well, let's do this. Let's welcome Blake Freking. He is a musher who lives in Finland, Minnesota, and he's also the marathon musher representative at the Beargrease. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
It should be pretty good, and let's kind of start right there. You know, mushing is something that not everybody does, and it's something that maybe they grow into or something like that. Tell us a little bit about your history. Did you grow up in a mushing family? Is this something that, how did you get to becoming a musher?
So that's a really good question because every musher is going to have a very different story when it comes to this. So I did not grow up in a mushing family. I grew up on a farm in southwest Minnesota, and we had lots of animals. So, I grew up taking care of animals and, learning about, nurturing cattle and all that, but it was something I was just drawn to at a fairly young age, and it started. I guess what really got me going is I started reading some Gary Paulson books, and I'll tell you a little story about Gary later. But so I got a dog, and I was skijuring with that one dog, which is skijuring is cross country skiing with 1 or 2 dogs in front of you. So it started with one dog, and I started doing trips, and I was amazed at how much country I could cover with just that one individual dog. And, things evolved a little bit. And then later, actually, my wife now, Jennifer, was in Alaska training for the Junior Iditarod. And I contacted her about buying a dog, which I did. And I guess that evolved to a lot of dogs because she had a pretty big kennel at the time. So...
It sounds to me like it was really just an interest that turned into a love for doing this. Is that the case, really?
It did. So Jennifer was in Alaska staying with some folks, and Earl Norris and Natalie was his wife. But they were heroes of mine. They had been in Alaska since the 40s and had done just a lot with sled dogs, including a lot of racing, but a lot of other things as well. And so I was just enamored by the fact that she was living with them. And Earl was having heart surgery in Rochester, Minnesota, and asked if I wanted to meet them. And I said, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I road tripped out to Rochester, and we had coffee. And Earl was just in recovery from heart surgery, so he didn't have a lot to say. But Natalie invited me up to handle for them. And at that point, I was out of school and had a great job and couldn't get this idea out of my head. So I pretty much dropped everything and went to Alaska to work for room and board and learn the sport of mushing. And so Earl and Natalie were both in their 80s at the time, still had 100 dogs. And they liked the way I worked with their team and the puppies that I was working with. And after a season with them, I signed up for the biggest race in the world. And the next year went up and qualified for Iditarod and ran it.
Well, let's jump in there real quick. You said just, in casual passing, 100 dogs. I mean, right. Come on now. That's a lot of poop. Like if we've got like 3 dogs in our world, maybe that's a lot. But I mean, 100 dogs. This is really truly a very specialized lifestyle, isn't it?
It is, and Earl and Natalie were very instrumental in the Siberian Husky. And so back in the 70s, a guy named George Atla showed up on the scene with some really good Alaskan village dogs and started winning all the races. And basically all the mushers at that point started, getting dogs from George and, going out to the villages and getting dogs. And the Siberian Husky started to vanish. As far as the racing Siberian Husky, I should say, there's still people were breeding for pets and shows and things like that. But Earl and Natalie really preserved the racing Siberian Husky. And it was one of the things that really drew me to that particular breed. And I guess that's what really got me going there. What's
the deal with a Siberian Husky as opposed to, like, we hear the term Husky, and a lot of people that, like, maybe had never seen a sled dog race before, they say, oh, the dogs are not what I was expecting. They're thinking like the more sort of like the stereotypical Hollywood big fluffy type
Freight
husky.
Pullers.
Yeah, right. What's the differentiation there?
So in the dog sledding world, which is a pretty eclectic group, I mean, I have to admit it, but we're the eclectic people amongst that group because we're still running purebred. Mm-hmm. So most of the teams you'll see, without a doubt, will be an Alaskan Husky, which is not a registered breed with the AKC or anything like that. It's a hybrid, and they can put whatever breed they want into it. So we decided to stick with the Siberian Husky, which really limits our gene pool and that kind of thing. But it's something I think is worth doing and preserving that part of the breed.
It's interesting to note, Blake, because when we think of the 2 most notable sled dogs in the world, Togo and Balto, were they Siberians?
They were, yes. They were part of Leonard Seppala's team. And so when they created the Siberian Husky as a breed, they used, I don't know off the top of my head how many dogs they used to be the basis of the breed. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they were part of that. And most of those dogs that were certainly descendants of or part of Seppala's original dogs. So yeah, so all of our dogs genetically go back to his stuff.
Well, let's talk about your dogs. What's your kennel? What size and how do you keep tabs on all of that?
Well, right now we've got 60 Huskies in the kennel.
Hmm? We do have a couple.
60.
Yeah, 60. Yeah.
we do have a few Alaskan Huskies, but mostly Siberian Huskies, and of course we have the German Shepherd and a Border Collie just to keep things evened out, I guess.
So what is your typical day like? Let's talk about that. I mean, obviously there's a lot of care and feeding, but what is your day like usually?
I didn't know anyone had typical days, honestly.
There you go. I love it.
So I don't know if we have such a thing as a typical day, but I mean, for the most part, it revolves around dog care. And of course, we're both working, so that's part of it too. But, first thing in the morning is taking care of dogs. We're, working on hydration and feeding and everything else. And then training comes into it too. Before we get to a race like Beargrease or the UP, we're sitting probably between 1,400 and 1,700 miles of training. So that's a substantial amount of time on the runners, above and beyond the care that the team gets on a regular basis.
Blake, I live half the week off grid. Half the week, just half. And I'm realizing when you say 60 dogs, that's a whole lot of hot water. because, of course, when temperatures are dipping into single digits, which mushers love, I mean, it's really a lot better to be in the dog yard at 10 and 20 degrees than it is at 70 and 80 degrees. But I can't imagine how you keep up with that care and feeding when you're off grid. How are you guys making hot water?
So we've been off grid now for about 20 years, and it has been an evolutionary process. I have to say, when I look back at how we managed things in the beginning, it was a little rough, maybe, but we have evolved. So we have a well, we have a large solar system, we have a backup diesel generator. So really, I mean, for the most part, I would say, if I didn't tell you, often you wouldn't know that we were even off grid. We have a pretty modern system. So we have a well, we have a typical water heaters and that kind of thing.
We're talking with Blake Freking today on the Lake Superior podcast. He's a musher in Finland, Minnesota, also the marathon musher representative with the Beargrease sled dog race. And Blake, as you heard in our introduction, we talked about a lot of these sled dog races that are going on around the Lake Superior area in the national parks of Lake Superior. Why do you think that there is such a rich sled dog history here in this area?
Yeah, good question. So in this country, we're so blessed to have so much public land in the form of national forests, national parks, national grasslands, and that kind of thing. And, most of the time, these places are in pretty wild countries, which is a perfect environment for a sled dog race. Mm-hmm. And, on top of that, a lot of these national forests, national parks have a history with sled dogs that go way back prior to the times, this was settled by Europeans. So, like in this area, the indigenous folks in this country were using, dogs with travois. Mm-hmm. They were using, teams not dissimilar to how we would hook up our teams. The history of John Beargrease himself was just that. He was delivering mail by dog team. And it's been, it's that way all over the North.
Yeah, we have the snow and we have the location and we got to get through it somehow. And that was a way that really did that. Now, you mentioned John Beargrease, and Beargrease we're talking about here today. Tell us a little bit about this race, first of all, before we even get how you're involved in it. I mean, what's a little bit of the history that you can share with us?
So John Beargrease was an Ojibwe man who he hauled the mail. And he went up and down the North Shore. During the winter, it was by dog team, and during the summer, it was in a boat. Yeah, and there was several different individuals that did it, but he was fairly renowned. And the race was brought about and wanted to honor him, and that's where the name came about. And
the race begins at Billy's Bar in Duluth. That's got to be a hopping place on Sunday, the 30th of January this year.
Yeah, Billy's is kind of an iconic spot in terms of the Beargrease. It's certainly, I've been involved with the race since 2004, I guess, and the start has always been at Billy's for the most part, unless there were weather concerns that they had to move it. But Billy's Bar has been pretty much synonymous with the race, at least since the time I've been involved.
And then the finish is in Grand Portage?
The finish is in Grand Portage. Yeah, the route takes us up the North Shore, and then we go north up the Gunflint Trail to Poplar Lake, and then back down, and the finish is in Portage.
How long is this race?
I believe it's right about 310 miles.
Okay. Yeah.
How long does that take?
The length has changed. The length has changed over the years. It started at 500, and then it was at 400, and it's about 3. And time frame we're looking at, we start midday on Sunday, and we finish Wednesday.
Okay.
So we can cover just over 100 miles a day.
Well, let's talk now with you, Blake, a little bit about how you've been involved with this race. Tell us a little bit about your direct involvement, the competition, even maybe some stories from the trail.
Yeah, so it really got me involved in the race. As a young kid, I remember following the race and the Star Tribune and, things like that back in the day. And it was always this thing that was in my head. And at that point, it was mushers like Jamie Nelson was winning and folks like that. And yeah, it was something that just always intrigued me. And I ended up starting my mushing career in Alaska first and came back down and ran the race and rookied in 2004. and I happened to win that race. And then I've run most of them since. I think I've run 16 or 17.
That's pretty good to kind of come in for the first time and just take it.
So
yeah.
When you are looking at that race, and you've already done the Quest and the Iditarod, how does it compare? I mean, obviously it's shorter, but how does it compare to the big races in Alaska?
Interesting question. It's hard to compare races because every race is so different. The Beargrease is unique. There's so many hills on this race. It actually has more altitude change than Iditarod.
Wow.
Because we're constantly going up and down. The Iditarod, you have some awfully big climbs. It's just very different. In other areas, other races, some kind of downtime. For instance, on the Iditarod, we're on the Yukon River for, a couple hundred miles. Obviously, that's pretty flat. And the same is true with the Yukon Quest. The Beargrease takes place in January, end of January. We can have some really cold temps. We can also, get some pretty warm temps. But yeah, every race is very, very unique, and it's just hard to compare.
So I get that. I can understand that because you're looking at different terrain. You're looking possibly at different times of year, different snow conditions, all of that, which all can go into it. But the Beargrease sounds like a tough race. I mean, this sounds like this is one that, is a challenge. It's designed to be one. You've won it. You've run it several times. What's, I guess, maybe a good story you can share with us about being out there or taking part in this event?
Oh, there's so many stories. It's great. One thing, just being on the trail with the dogs is the main thing. And that's really the biggest part. It's what we're working toward all the time. And then there's the competitive aspect. And then there's the people that we meet. When we go to these races, a lot of these folks that we associate with at the race, we only see once a year. So it's nice to have kind of that kind of reunion with folks every year. So it's a bit of all that draws me to these races.
When can you start running dogs to be prepared to do 300 and some miles?
So we start our training. The training really goes year round. We've got about a 3-acre enclosed area that we will let the dogs play in. So during the summer months when it's too warm to really run them in a team, we let them free run for an hour or 2 hours a day, just to get out and play. And it keeps them fit for one, but also it allows them, some really good social time, and they can go out and play and just be dogs without there's a little different dynamic when we hook them up in a team. And, that just allows them to get out and play, but it also keeps them fit. And then, our temperature cutoff is about 50 degrees. So usually that's about mid-August. We'll start getting some decent temps that we can hook them up in. And usually that's 4 a.m, and we'll hook up then. And so that's when it starts. So it starts out with just a few miles, and then we just keep building until we're doing, 40 and 50 mile runs.
We're talking with Blake Freking today on the Lake Superior podcast. He is a musher from Finland, Minnesota. We're talking also with him about the Beargrease sled dog race. And he is marathon musher representative on the board.
When you have a kennel of dogs and you're a dog musher, it's really important for, I think, our listeners to understand that they are not fur-covered snowmobiles. And what Blake and Jenny and their family have up there on that North Shore is a year-long commitment. So it's not just a hobby, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's a lifestyle. Wouldn't you say, Blake?
It really is a lifestyle. And, it's not like other toys that you can just put away for a little while, like maybe a snowmobile or a race car or something like that. It's 365 days a year, 7 days a week, and it's every day, every night, whether we're sick or anything else. So it's a huge commitment, and it takes up a lot of time. And that's where, I'm racing, my wife Jennifer's racing, and now the kids are racing. And you kind of have to have that buy-in. Otherwise, it creates stress within the family a little bit because the other component is the monetary part. Dog food's pretty expensive. And it's a lot of time. Before we get to the races, we're putting on 1,200 to 1,700 miles. So it's a lot of time as well, and it's time out on the trail. And if you can't share that with the family, it gets pretty tough. But yeah, it's a huge commitment. It's certainly not for the faint of heart because it is a lot of work as well.
We're talking with Blake Freking today, who's a musher from Finland, Minnesota. He's also the marathon musher representative with the Beargrease sled dog race. And Blake, earlier on in our chat, you alluded to an author that really kind of got you interested in this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why it was important?
Oh, yeah. So I was probably 11 or 12 years old, and I started reading Gary Paulson's books, and one was Winter Dance, and it was about him running his first Iditarod. And I remember going to the library, and that was back in the old days where you used to sign your name on the book to check it out. And I remember, like, the whole sign-out slip was just my name, one after another. And I remember the librarian saying, "You must like this book, huh?" Of course I did. And, yeah, Gary was pretty influential indirectly through his book, getting me involved in the sport. And, funny story about Gary. So at the Iditarod start, first leg, they have a ceremonial start, and we carry a passenger, and people bid to ride with us. So because of that, we can't use our race sled. We have to use a toboggan. And the one I was intending to use got pretty broken up. Mm-hmm. And I put the word out to a few folks that I was looking for a sled to use for my passenger at the start. And a mutual friend said, "Well, Gary offered up his sled." So, so it kind of came full circle at the end. So, and it was interesting because he said he had run that sled in the 1985 Iditarod. And as I'm going through the start with my passenger and the Iditarod start, I was thinking, man, this is the sled that I read about when I was 11 years old. So
that's pretty cool.
It's kind of interesting. And very cool.
You know what I love about this, Blake? You shared with Walt and I that your very first race was the Iditarod. And I believe Gary's first race also was the Iditarod. I mean, like, go big or go home. I think he's since passed, and what a wonderful writer. And frankly, he has connections, of course, to Minnesota, but also to some of the mushers that were up in Schroeder and Finland area who've since moved over to Michigan. He's written a little bit about Lloyd Gilbertson and has his Cold Trails and Puppy Dog Tales or something. One of those titles, I think he's dedicated it to Lloyd, the good Lloyd, as we would say about him. But, anybody that wants to pick up a great winter read, any of Gary's books, but of course the books that he's written about mushing, he has one of the most hilarious stories. And Walt and I have never had this happen. I'm going to knock on wood right now, but leaving out of, I think it was maybe the Yukon Quest, that he got his team was so wild, he ended up trying to lasso a bumper on a car somewhere on the road. And I think where he's written that, it still sticks in my mind. And oh my gosh, there's such great stories. And I think that's, again, why we just love and embrace the sport, because it's not just a hobby. It is that lifestyle that creates the stories and what you and Jen are giving to your daughters now. So you think that they might be coming and racing around the Great Lakes a little bit here? Those young girls you got?
So actually my oldest daughter, she's 12, but she was talking about her schedule, and I realized you have got a pretty interesting race schedule this year. So she's entered in the Beargrease Cub Run, which is a kids race, and it's the week before the Beargrease. So she signed up for that. She signed up for the Beargrease 40. She'll be coming out to the Copper Dog in your neighborhood, coming up in a bit. And she's running a race in Ely, and so they have a pretty busy race schedule themselves.
Well, you've been talking about the Beargrease a little bit, and I'm sure that there's people that are interested in and the whole sport of mushing. But if people have questions about the Beargrease, maybe can you point them in a direction so they can find out a little bit more?
Yeah, so the Beargrease is active on all the social media platforms. They can phone there, and beargrease.com is the website. And the race is always the last weekend in January. It always starts on a Sunday. So this year it's on the 29th of January.
Okay. And also about you and your kennel and these, 60 dogs and everything like that. Are you out there for people to check out as well?
Yeah, we're on Facebook, Manitou Crossing Kennels, and Instagram, and our website is racingsiberians.com.
Well, that's pretty cool. Now, before we cut you loose here, I know Frida's got a couple questions for you as well, but I guess I'm just curious as to, for people that just aren't, like, they're not aware of what mushing is. They have an idea, or maybe they've seen some movie depiction of sled dogs and everything like that. What's the thing you might want to leave with them about this sport?
I guess the biggest thing is just, the love and admiration we have for these canine athletes we work with. We spend so much time with them, and we know each individual so entirely well. I was just thinking about, I've got a lead dog who's 9. He's going to be turning 10 in the spring, and he and I have traveled 27,000 miles together. And it's pretty amazing, the connection we can have with an individual, and him specifically led probably most of those miles. So, yeah, it's pretty amazing connection that we have with them. And then also, the incorporation of all the people and all the wonderful folks, associated with the sport.
I want to take a step back. When you talk about traveling and what you mean with those 27,000 miles, that's where you've been on the runners with your team, right? When you clock up those miles.
That's just runners.
Yeah. Blake, just share with some folks, because, some people say, well, I'm not going to go to the Upper Peninsula, or I'm not going to go up to the North Shore because I got 2 kids in the back seat. They have no idea. When you're traveling with a dozen dogs on your dog truck, or maybe more, give us just a little bit of an idea what that's all about.
Yeah, so when we travel with dogs, we've got an enclosed trailer that we retrofitted to accommodate dogs, and they have a bunch of individual boxes in the dogs. And we went with the trailer just, it was a lot easier to manage climate control inside there. So they have fresh air all the time and temperature control and that kind of stuff. So we travel with dogs, and once we're on the move, we're entirely on the dog schedule. So they get dropped out of their boxes every, couple hours, and so we set the schedule totally on them. And they're really good at traveling. We do it enough that, they're really comfortable with it. And yeah, it's just, and, for dogs, it's just about making it all fun. So we try and, have positive associations with everything we do. So yeah, and that includes travel. So yeah, that's how we travel, and we go all over the place. We've raced overseas and done all kinds of stuff. So the sport has opened up a lot of doors for us.
It is a lot of adventure, man. And wow. You've given us a lot of great info here. Certainly want to appreciate your time today, Blake. And I'm sure you got to go feed the dogs and go run them and do all that kind of stuff. So thanks for your time with us today. And thanks for all this insight into the sport of mushing.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
That's Blake Freking, who is a musher from Finland, Minnesota. He's also a marathon musher representative with the Beargrease. And Frida, there was just like you told me going into this that Blake is a good chatter about all this kind of stuff. He knows this stuff, and really what's fantastic about talking with him is this gives good insight for those of us to take in the UP 200 or the Copper Dog or any of these other races that are here in the region around Lake Superior.
Absolutely. And more than anything, Walt, it happens to us every time we are there at the UP 200. I say, I need more mushers in my life. I think we all do. It gets to be winter. We get sour about maybe it's cold and it's snowing. And I love to say that there's absolutely nothing you could ever complain to a musher about.
Absolutely.
Are you going to say to them, I'm tired, I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm sore, I'm frustrated, I'm broke, I'm
and Blake, really did a great job of kind of talking about why this is such a big part of the legacy of the land around Lake Superior, where all the national parks are that we talk about here on the podcast. And I'm looking forward to finding out more about mushing. And I did want to mention one thing when I talked to my friends, and I learned this through working with you and the UP Sled Dog Association, that it is a sled dog race, not a dog sled race, because they always tell me it's the dogs that race and not the sleds. So that's something to keep in mind. But this was a great chat, I'd have to say.
And absolutely understanding that those dogs are not fur-covered snowmobiles, that the care that goes on all year long, always looking, building the team, using those genes, understanding play is just as important as those runs are. It's really something. And bottom line, building trust. If we all even thought about how we raise our children with the same care that Jennifer and Blake Freking have when they're raising their sled dog team. teams.
I know. It's just amazing. And it was a good chat with Blake, and he had to run. But it happens when you've got 60 dogs in your kennel, and he's got to get out there. But we appreciate his time for joining us on the podcast today. Now, if you have an idea you maybe like to have us talk about, do a podcast on, you can find the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation website. Send a comment. It'll get to Frida. It'll get to me, and we'll hopefully be able to do a topic on our podcast about that. But that's going to do it for us on this one. Get on out and enjoy everything that there is to offer in the national parks around Lake Superior, and we encourage you to do it all year round with things like, sled dog races and a few other things. But it's going to do it for us. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks so much for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior Podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And sponsored by Uber Creative Agency, a boutique web design, development, and marketing agency based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with clients across the U.S. We don't just provide services, we deliver value.